gifts were used. This is the first one.
All right, thank you. We had a bit of a technical difficulty. We can clean that up in post. But thanks for joining. I'm going to talk about some key questions and considerations for gift acceptance. I think it's something that all nonprofits are interested in as much as possible. Obviously, accepting gifts, accepting donations. It's a wonderful aspect of the community. But there are definitely some times we need to think about when it's appropriate or when it may be not worth the effort or obligation to accept some gifts. And we'll talk about some of those issues. But as I mentioned, the key questions here: 1, should our organization accept the gift? 2, if we accept it, what should we do with it? And 3, is there a policy that directs us how to answer these questions? And if you have a question about developing a policy, you'll want to contact Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta to work through that. Some questions we're not going to get into here because of their kind of complexity and side issues. How do we accept and manage investments? Probably do a whole nother podcast or a webcast about that. And then what are the tax consequences of certain gifts? Again, that's a whole nother field that needs to be reviewed by appropriate experts or legal counsel. So looking at the question of should I accept this gift? The first thing, and it's maybe even not as much of a legal question, but does it really fit with your mission? Each nonprofit is going to have its own mission statement, its own purpose, and don't want to accept gifts that run afoul of that mission. Is it worth the restrictions or obligations that may come with the gift? Maybe if it's a gift donation of real property or of something that requires maintenance, maybe an old vehicle. Is it worth accepting that gift and then having to deal with the maintenance issues? If there's insurance, do you have the staff to maintain it and manage it? Obviously, many nonprofits are very small organizations. They're focused on their mission, and volunteers and donations like that can kind of put a monkey wrench into the resolving those mission problems and resolving just organizational issues that come up. And lastly, does it create a conflict of interest? Obviously, that's a kind of a fuzzy area, but you certainly want to make sure that you're not creating a conflict based on who the person donating the gift is. They can cause you problems later. And the best advice here really is to, as you've seen a lot of gray issues, is create a policy to help you answer these questions. As we'll talk through, there's no right answer to many of these questions. There's no single black and white rule that you can portray to answer whether or not a gift should be accepted. And what you're going to want to do is have a policy, an internal policy that explains how the committee or how the individual is going to determine if the gift should be accepted, if it's a non-routine gift. Routine gifts of money and financial benefits, I don't know that you necessarily need to take those to a policy or committee. You may even allow staff or your website to accept donations like that. But it's really those non-routine gifts that you may want the board or a select committee to review. And also that policy hopefully will answer, when is an expert needed? If somebody provides you something of unique value that is not readily apparent, or something that you as an organization are not used to dealing with or managing, even if, we'll talk about legal counsel in a second, but you may just want to bring in an expert to help you rationalize if that gift is something that would be beneficial or more burdensome to your organization. When is legal counsel needed? Basically, I think as an attorney, if you as an organization even hesitate to accept a gift, you probably should speak with legal counsel. I know Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is always happy to help answer these types of questions. And then, maybe there are some, like it's mentioned, the routine gifts. Maybe there's some common gifts that your organization happens to receive. If you help an organization helping children, you may receive toys frequently and as a routine matter. You may receive stuffed animals. And so you want to address those types of things in your policy. How do you accept those types of donations? Is there a cleaning process, or is there a review process for safety? Things like that you can put into your policy and adhere to as your organization continues. So as part of that, it kind of leads, I think, from what I've said, is you want to define some certain classifications of gifts that meet and do not meet your mission. Of course, it always depends, and there's going to be exceptions to those rules, and that's what the board or your committee can work through. But having a preset buckets that you can put those gifts into will help process those questions much faster, and can allow your staff to manage things themselves as much as possible. So the point that all this kind of tailors to is, who in your organization determines what gifts are reasonable, and what restrictions and obligations are reasonable or unreasonable. As I mentioned, each nonprofit's different. You may give a gift of sports equipment to one organization. They may find that to be routine. It's something they have no problem with. But then to another organization that has nothing to do with sports, to receive a basketball goal and to have to deal with that, to resell it or to maintain it, that can be more of a burdensome piece of property to donate. As I mentioned, the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta does maintain a template gift acceptance policy. They can work with you and legal counsel to tailor that to your specific organization through discussion of your mission, your risk profile, who serves on your board, and how to best process that with your staff. As I mentioned, every organization is different. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and that's where the policy really comes in and needs to be tailored to your organization's specific needs. We did have some hypotheticals to run through. I don't know if there are any questions.
Yes, do all nonprofits need a gift acceptance policy if you're a small organization that just gets like monetary donations and volunteers who donate their time? Do you still need one?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is always helpful if you have time to put something like this together. You don't know, things may be routine at this point, but it's always easier to kind of think through those questions when you don't have something pressing at that moment. So the point may come when somebody does offer a non-routine gift, and it's better to have resolved those types of questions in a policy, in a written policy ahead of time, instead of having to make that determination, what may be a very quick determination. You may be given a matter of hours or a matter of days to decide, and if you have not thought through that or written those items down in a policy, then it just leads to the complexity.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we'll walk through some different hypotheticals. As I mentioned, these are very fact-specific. Each organization is going to answer them differently, so if you have questions or comments about these, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I think we'll pick an organization we'll call Dry High, and this is a nonprofit that encourages alcohol abstinence among high school students. It's a very small nonprofit with 2 staff members and you as the executive director. The organization speaks monthly at public schools and offers students after-school activities. And basically just had to pick, kind of an organization that might be representative of some, but we need to kind of give some bounds to what may be burdensome and what may not be burdensome, so we can get through some of these questions. And again, these hypotheticals don't have one right answer, so if you disagree or want to approach it differently, then especially how you might apply it to your organization, then that would be something to apply in your policy. So hypothetical number 1, just a regular cash donation. Somebody wants to donate $1,000 to purchase beer and wine at your adults-only annual fundraising gala. Cash donations, I think, are fairly routine normally. This one is a bit maybe non-routine in that it's for a specific purpose. It is to purchase beer and wine, and if you remember, our organization is supportive of not drinking. This is an adults-only gala, but does it really fit with the mission of the organization? If you're planning on having a soft drinks and water, and tea, and no adult beverages at your fundraising gala, which might be appropriate for your mission, then this would be a donation you probably would want to deny. That said, if it's an organization that is carefully separating the needs of the students and recognizes that to encourage more fundraising, you might want to offer some more adult beverages to your attendees, then you might be willing to accept that difference. Again, these are not supposed to be one right answer, but things to think about. And the way you address it in your policy is to have a committee defined, whether it's a selection of board members, maybe board members and staff, to discuss should we accept this or not. This is one, maybe might involve legal counsel, but frankly, I think this is probably more of a within the organization determination, less of a legal issue and just more of a does it support the mission issue. Well, at least to serve alcohol at your fundraising gala might be a legal issue. Hopefully not. Let's take this hypothetical just a little bit further on the analysis. So we've talked about how it fits with your mission, but how does this change if the donation comes from a local liquor store? If that liquor store might be located near the local high school where you speak, whether knowingly or not, maybe serving some of these students after school, beer and wine, and certainly the sponsorship of this organization, this beer and wine store, the liquor store. If they want to put an ad in the gala program, is that maybe a step too far? I think probably that's further down the road of not supporting the mission of the organization. You're not just accepting the cash, but you're also supporting that business that has a kind of a fundamental opposition to what your mission is. Hypothetical number 2. This donation is for real estate. It's 2 nice tennis courts that are kept in the local neighborhood. You could say they're near one of the schools that you work with, and the neighborhood doesn't use them during the week and is willing to donate them to your organization for use for after-school activities. The neighborhood would like to continue using them in the weekends for their own Alta tournaments, but they're willing to give you the property, let you maintain them, and then they'll just use them on the weekends. Now, this is a difficult question, I think, for a small organization. If you remember, we have only 2 staff members and the executive director. It certainly seems to be beneficial to the organization. I think you could say that without question, to have that after-school activity for your students. But going back to hopefully your policy, you'd want to have your board consider the obligations that would come with these tennis courts. So in that analysis, you have maintenance issues, you'd have property taxes if you own the real estate, insurance obligations. If your after-school activities are things that occur on-site in the schools, then it's possible the school, you've already worked out relationships with the school, agreements with the school to handle insurance and care for the buildings. But if this is now the first time the organization has owned real estate and had to deal with maintenance of real estate, then that's a next step. And then also, of course, students getting injured when they're playing. It's a lot of obligations here. And again, it's not something that I can say, in every fact pattern wouldn't be a great donation. And in a lot of organizations, I think they would welcome this, but it may not be for everyone. But it's really thinking through those points. One thing to think about as well is, why is the neighborhood wanting to get rid of this? And I think a lot of times when we accept donations, it's with the greatest of intent in the mind of the person donating. But unfortunately, sometimes they may just be trying to dump something that they don't want to maintain anymore. So is there a problem with the courts? Are they going to need to be resurfaced? Is it a maintenance hazard? There's certainly some legal issues there that you're going to want to bring in legal counsel to help review. Probably an expert who can take a look at the courts and see what the maintenance obligations are. And then frankly, how do you manage the weekend use by the neighborhood? Are you then going to release the courts or give them some kind of agreement so they can play on the weekends, how is insurance going to be managed, and court maintenance, wear and tear that comes on those weekend uses, what happens on that property when you're not there. Are you going to have to install security cameras? A whole host of issues that really need to be vetted and discussed by your board committee. Looking at hypothetical number 3, this donation would be for commercial investment. And so this is probably the more complicated of the hypotheticals. A local coffee shop wants to donate 25% of the ownership of their coffee shop so that you can cooperate with them and allow students to come there after school and late in the evenings to study. Provides a safe alternative that doesn't involve drinking. And again, this is something that I think on its face has a lot of benefits for your mission and for your organization. A nonprofit could, in theory, reap some financial benefits, but of course you also have to be wary of violating your nonprofit status with the IRS and seek legal counsel on that question. But then there's also the question of, should a nonprofit be a participant in owning a business from a practical perspective? Commercial partnerships, when we look at the analysis, commercial partnerships always create risk, right? If you're a part owner, you may be affected by not just the benefits of the business that when it does well, but then also the ramifications if it doesn't do well. I think this is probably the clearest case where you definitely want to contact your legal counsel or pro bono partnership of Atlanta to get assistance in a deal this complex, and think about some of the maybe some alternatives. So in the case of like the tennis courts, I think it may be more difficult to find alternatives. Maybe you kind of reach out and say, maybe we could just borrow the courts for some time. But it seemed to be clear that there was a distinct purpose that they were trying to get rid of the tennis courts. In this situation, I think it lends itself maybe to more alternatives of working out some kind of less concrete partnership with the coffee shop. If you really want, if it's nearby the schools and you want your students to go there and use it, maybe you volunteer staff to work there at extra hours so that students can work there and study. Finding a way that is more contractually based as opposed to ownership based, so you're not taking on the burdens of owning, even partly owning something that is a business you're not used to running, that is not doesn't itself fit the mission, right? Your mission is really to help students, and owning the coffee shop as a side benefit helps the students, but does the direct benefit really help the students? And again, the best solution is to have this vetted by your board, have a policy that directs how these questions should be answered. As we were saying earlier, it's much easier to work through some of those hypotheticals and areas that your mission and your and risks that your organization is willing to take and not willing to take on the front end when you have some quiet moments as a board, instead of kind of in the heat of being made these offers, where you may even have parties that are related to the board, or maybe related to the staff, or related to you as an executive director. Instead of having to kind of provide hurt feelings, if, for instance, this coffee shop maybe is a good friend, or maybe even a board member, or somebody who's related to the organization, which for a partnership like this would probably be most likely. If you can point to a policy, if you can point to an independent decision-making process, then I think all parties will be better off. The fourth hypothetical is another type of financial investment. It's an offer that a parent of a student has offered to give you 1,000 shares of company stock, we'll call it Acme company stock, from their personal portfolio. The stock's currently worth $100,000. There's a few points already just from that hypothetical, but then I'll also add that the bequeath is conditioned on Dry High serving 50 new students every year for the next 10 years. So increasing its capacity to serve the community and its actual service of the community over the next 10 years. So first, in this analysis, I think one of the key questions is this really even a donation yet? It sounds to me more like a pledge for a donation that has not, he's not giving you the stock immediately. You would expect there would have to be some sort of contract or a trust built to make sure that you're actually getting these funds if the conditions are met. But even in that circumstance, does your organization want to accept company stock like this in exchange for those obligations? Those obligations are maybe reasonable sounding on their face. A little bit more growth, looks like 50 more students, maybe just not too far off a natural progression of the organization. But setting that up as a hard obligation that's cut and dried may be difficult with your staff support. It's difficult to plan out that many years in advance how the organization is going to grow, how it's going to serve the community, if those community needs can still be met and still need to be met in 10 years. And of course, this was a bequeath at the individual's death. That's a long time away. This hypothetical, I think, maybe a bit unrealistic in that part of the situation if the person's a parent. But if they're an older person, maybe if you can even play out 20 years instead of 4 years, you possibly might receive the stock. Is that still something that you're willing to wait for as an organization? And what is the value of the stock going to be at that point? These are all issues to consider, and just a lot of uncertainty that comes with this pledge. But I think the fundamental point too, even if we were to say that this was an immediate gift of stock that your policy would want to review, and it's important to consider, is would Dry High, even if accepting it at that moment, would it want to sell or keep that stock? Is your organization one that is willing to accept the risk of the markets and see if that stock goes up later or sells off, or it goes up or comes back down? Is the stock publicly tradable and marketable? Is it a publicly traded stock that you can sell immediately? I know it may sound like a broken record, but these are really some key issues for your gift policy. Again, I think once you accept that type of donation, even if accepted at that moment and it goes into the assets of the organization, I would imagine there's going to be a lot of discussion and disagreement about whether or not to sell that. You're going to have some board members who are familiar with the market, want to keep it, want to follow it, and know that company. You're going to have other board members who say, look, this is not part of our mission statement, this is not part of what we do as an organization, we should just sell it. And like I said, it's much better to have those discussions in a quiet moment when discussing hypotheticals, as opposed to kind of in the heat of trying to decide a specific situation where disagreements can just lead to acrimony or fundamental issues about where the mission statement of the organization is. It's just much easier to handle those in a written policy. Hypothetical number 5, this is the last hypothetical. This one goes back to another type of real estate. So a private school principal has offered to donate 2 acres of undeveloped land adjacent to his school if Dry High builds a permanent facility in the land to meet with his school students daily, not just monthly. So this kind of combines the earlier points of real estate without maybe specifically the maintenance issues we talked about of the existing tennis courts, but also the conditions that we talked about on the stock. But these are conditions that are much more tailored to your mission. And I think this might be a closer call in whether or not it could be beneficial, and an organization might be willing to accept those obligations and requirements to obtain such a prized donation. That said, I think there's still some considerations here. We've talked about the impact of the mission, and certainly having a local building and facility right next to the school can benefit that school. But what about other resources and how those resources are expended for the remaining schools? This donation does not provide additional staff necessarily. And does this mean that you're going to see diminished visits and time and attention to the existing schools if your mission is really for public schools and students in those schools, then maybe a private school that kind of can come in and allocate certain resources in this way? There's some question maybe about whether or not that fits exactly with the mission. Essentially, is it fair and proper to receive that type of special treatment based on that donation? Again, these are things for your board to discuss in contemplation with your mission. I think that just kind of goes to the mission part, but then there's also the considerations, kind of the more practical considerations of the obligations to build on the land. If you're a small organization with 2 staff members, are you really prepared to build a new structure? Do you have experts and contractors willing and able to? Would they donate their time? Would you have to pay for this facility? It's certainly a big expense that would be required to build a facility like that. What if it was at headquarters? If the donation was given with the expectation that you would meet with students more regularly, could you meet with them in the school, or could you and use that property for your own your organizational headquarters? And would that work? But probably, I think the more likely is that the expectations of the school were to build like a gym or some type of after-school activity facility. How useful would that facility be for your overall organization, or would it really just be tailored to that school? I think in this situation, these are questions that some organizations, they're well-funded, have a long history, and staff and resources ability to take on a project like this. They may find this to be useful and a great donation, but others in their building phase may not, and your policy and procedures will want to reflect those characteristics. So let's take this a little bit further. What if the principal says that he'll fund a gym, but only if you put his name on it? Is there a conflict of interest there? He's a private school principal. It's not really connected to a school. I think there's some questions there. And then take it further, what if he just received a DUI and is trying to rebuild his reputation? Obviously your organization is favoring abstinence from drinking and alcohol, and he sees your organization as a good vehicle to help rebuild his reputation. Again, I think having a policy here to avoid interpersonal issues, if this principal is somebody that otherwise supports your organization and has a lot of sway in the community, then it's much easier, again, to have your policy and some objective standards dictate how you respond, as opposed to just the interpersonal discussions, and it could be awkward and could be detrimental to the kind of publicity and the reputation of the organization. And taking it one more step further, what if those funds came from his mayoral campaign? He's wanting to improve his chances at running for office. I think that's probably a whole other webcast on proper donations when it comes to mixing politics and nonprofits. But these are all certainly aspects of the due diligence that, with legal counsel and your board carefully reviewing based on policy recommendations that could keep your organization out of trouble, and dig deeper into these types of donation offers. So looking at takeaways, as we talked about, the main question really is, do you want to accept the gift? Does it support the mission? Does it truly, in the long term, really help the organization, or does it really burden it with responsibilities, restrictions, or obligations that were unexpected or unwanted? And does it involve a questionable source? Who is trying to provide the donation? Is it somebody who's trying to release property or materials that are unusable or really detrimental? Or is it somebody who is really has the best interest of the organization and your mission at heart? The second question we talked about was, what will you do with the gift? And the main thing is, do you have the experience to own and manage it or even sell it? Is it property that's marketable? Is it property that can be liquidated to generate funds immediately? What's that process to decide what to do with it? As we've talked about, who's going to decide? Is it a board? Is it a committee? And then I think, just as importantly, can the gift be simplified while accomplishing the same goal? Clearly, with somebody willing to donate substantial property to your organization, you would hope that they have the best intentions at heart and will want to work with you to find the right solution. They don't want to create more burdens and obligations for you that the organization is not willing to accept just as much as you do, if they really do have the best intentions of the organization at heart. So again, it's best to draft this good policy to cover these situations, or at least give you a framework for how to resolve these questions and situations. Obviously, no policy covers every situation, and that's why you have these teams or a committee to review the donations based on that framework, based on the mission of the organization. And of course, like I said, if you receive a donation or an offer for a donation that makes you hesitate, please do contact your legal counsel or Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta, and they can help you through the legal questions and help with that due diligence, whether it's with an expert or with the person donating the materials, or both, to determine if it is the best for your organization in the long term. That concludes this webcast, at least for the primary content. I do want to point out that there is another webcast called Thanking Donors the Legal Way that is also available if you'd like to have more information about, after you've accepted a donation, how to best thank your givers and your supporters. And I'll take any other questions that maybe came from the chat room.
Yes, we have one question. What is the tax advantage to donors who donate land to nonprofits?
That's a good question. I am not a tax attorney, so I will let
That's a great
I'll let that
question.
stand for Pro Bono Partnership or
A great question to present to
legal
a Pro
counsel.
Bono Partnership attorney.
Yeah, thanks.
And are these, if you were to have a policy, is a policy something you should put on your nonprofit's website? Is that for donors, or do you keep that internal?
The policy I'm thinking about is an internal policy that is just for your board. That said, that policy, your internal policy, may develop some guidelines that you can suggest to supporters. So if you do have a consistent group of supporters who are wanting to donate things that are non-routine or unusual, you can certainly present guidelines to the supporters on your website that direct them. We only take materials that are clean. Get back to your, if it's a children's charity, maybe that are clean, that are new, things like that can give you some guidelines, or maybe up to a certain value or above a certain value, things like that. But the policy I'm thinking of is more for internal use.
Okay. And I believe that's all the questions we have.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.